Hello, this is Nicholas Burris from the OEH at the OEH annual meeting in Sacramento. I am here with Dr. Bob Reinhardt from Boise State University, formerly director of the Willamette Heritage Center, as well as Dr. Leslie Dunlap from Willamette University. And we are going to discuss their session, History in the News. Could you give us some background on your show's creation?
Sure. So when I started at the Willamette Heritage Center, I had previously been teaching in higher ed, and I had really loved some of the interesting and fascinating work that my colleagues and friends were doing, and I was a little bit anxious about going into a museum setting and leaving some of that work behind me, and knowing that my colleagues had really interesting and relevant things to say, but didn't really have a venue in which to say it, so I thought this would be a great opportunity to leverage the new space that I was going to be the director of. I also knew that our members at the Willamette Heritage Center were really interested in hearing from these academic historians. And so not only was I interested in providing this kind of a program for our current members, I really wanted to reach out to potential new audiences, people that might have looked at our museum and thought that's antiquated or antiquarian or irrelevant, and I wanted to get them in the door. And then on a personal level, and I think like everyone that's going to be looking at this, I believe that history is important for us to understand where we are in the present, right? But then more broadly, wouldn't it be great if more people could think and analyze like historians do? And I thought that this might be a kind of a way of doing that. So that was kind of where it started. And then having worked with Leslie, I'm friends with Leslie, I needed somebody who could help me shake out some of these really vague ideas, and Leslie was kind enough to join up.
And I was coming from a classroom experience teaching history at Willamette, and for the year before we conceived the project, I had been working for the Oregon Humanities, doing a project they call the Conversation Project. And in that, one goes around and facilitates conversations with not-for-profits, community colleges, any organization that has asked you to come speak on a particular topic. And at that point, I really, really enjoyed reaching an audience beyond the classroom, beyond a reading public, and really enjoyed the intergenerational and multifaceted conversations that were had. So I thought, wow, I really like these public conversations. Wouldn't it be great to continue to have them? And the project I did for Conversation Project was a history of marriage. It was called Something Old, Something New, considering the state of marriage in Oregon. And so I really enjoyed the ability to translate between what historians were saying about the history of marriage and contemporary debates about same-sex marriage and marriage equality that were going on in Oregon at that time. So for me, it gave me a real sense of, as an historian, being a participant in these broader conversations and helping people understand that, for example, marriage is not a timeless institution, it has a history. And so it was great also to have audience-driven conversations where I wasn't just an expert coming in and lecturing, but that people were commenting on their own understandings of the history of marriage, their own understanding of their role in shaping those conversations.
Right. Your program has had many exciting and timely topics. There was one show that centered around the question of whether historians should be pundits. Could you talk about what inspired that particular theme for the show and whether being labeled a pundit is unavoidable once the historian enters the public arena and begins to tackle very controversial issues like immigration, race, public monuments, etc.?
Yeah, so where that program came, that was, maybe 6 or 7 programs into the series. And there had been a couple of editorials. One in the New York Times, I think, was titled "Historians Should Not Be Pundits," and so we wanted to explore that. And there was also sort of this. There were more discussions about historians taking a more active role in interpreting what was happening in current politics. And so we wanted to participate in that. And also, as the museum administrator, I had heard some concerns, not necessarily complaints, but concerns from some of my members that the historians we were inviting to this roundtable were going beyond what they should be doing from the perspective of some of these members. Maybe the historians should just be focusing on the past rather than engaging so explicitly in the present. And so we needed to talk about this, and this was one of the larger roundtables we had. I think we had maybe 5 or 6 people that participated in this conversation. So that's where that came from, and it was also just a really interesting opportunity. I'm totally losing my train of thought on that. So
okay, we'll edit that where you.
Yeah, thank you. But what more do you? How about you, Leslie? What do you think?
I struggle with the question because it seems to me if a pundit is an expert, what is the problem with historians being experts in their field?
Right.
Now, maybe the question becomes, are you an expert in the present? And what authority can you claim in contemporary conversations? And I think historians, there are 2 aspects to that question. One is, when did historians start becoming political? And the other is, when did historians start becoming so public and reaching beyond, again, classrooms or readership? And I think both of those questions are historical questions. And most historians would agree historians have always been political and had a particular interpretation or perspective, and also done a really good job, I think, in historiography in locating themselves politically and understanding where their work fits into a larger conversation. So I would say historians have long been pundits. The question then about reaching a public, I think, is different and new in terms of thinking about the way Twitter, podcasts, TED Talks, these other ways of reaching various publics. I think that may be adding a new dimension to the question. I don't know, how do you think that may have changed the question?
And I think that if we think about some of the original motivation for the program, which was to help people become better at thinking about the past and commenting, that is, being a pundit about the past. Like, I guess I don't really have a problem with pundits per se. I just want them to be better when it comes to thinking about the past. So I think it's actually a label that maybe some historians, if they do it right, could wear with pride.
I also think the question about teaching, and your role as an expert in the classroom, but also drawing on other people's expertise and showing people how to make good arguments is something we were also trying to model. So again, how to be a good pundit, how to be a good citizen.
That's right.
Right. And especially in this environment too, when there's sort of an expectation that I think is encouraged through like platforms like Twitter and Facebook, where everything has a comment section or something like that. There's almost an expectation that anyone can take on the role of like being a pundit, regardless of their expertise or knowledge.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think they should comment. I just want to hopefully, as you said, model maybe some strategies for doing that well in a thoughtful, deliberative manner. What we strived for, and I think we were able to maintain a respectful environment, really productive and interesting conversations, which is the kind of thing I'd like to see more pundits doing.
Right.
And I had some interesting questions after that session from audience members. One person came up in particular and said, how can you be objective in the classroom? You're just imposing your views on your students. Or how do you, he really asked, how do you ensure that you're not? So at that moment, I had this opportunity to talk about teaching and talk about what it meant to build an argument and how I graded and how I encouraged students to use evidence to make their point. So at that moment, I also felt like I was teaching someone about what happens in a college classroom who might not have the experience of being in one.
Right.
So that I'm not just lecturing and giving my view, but in fact, I'm enabling people to build arguments on the basis of evidence that they arrange, and how to ask questions and how to seek for answers in conversation with other people. So,
right. Very good. Could you tell us about the show on public monuments?
Yes. That show originated in part in response to, obviously, questions around Charlottesville, Confederate monuments in New Orleans, Raleigh-Durham, but it also had a more local angle. in that at Oregon State University there was a big process underway where at the urging and activism of students, people began to question why certain buildings were named after specifically pro-slavery advocates and advocates of white supremacy. So students had really driven a conversation there, and this was happening at OSU right at that moment. So we invited a range of people and ended up broadening the conversation beyond Confederate monuments, but to look more broadly at questions of Native mascotry and naming sports teams after Native Americans. And really right at that moment there was a conversation going on in Albany, Oregon about the mascot, the Rebels. And so we were really interested in getting people talking about what was happening both nationally, but also how we think about commemorative culture and memorialization and history as a whole. That was a huge turnout. There were 100 people there, and I think was one of my favorite sessions. And we asked questions, or audience members asked questions like, when you rename monuments, isn't that erasing history? So we got to have a great conversation about, no, this is actually about engaging in history, and we had a conversation about how history is a process of revision and contesting interpretations, and it actually brought history more alive, was a conclusion of the panel. Though people also had disagreements within the panel about the process by which you rename or reconsider monuments. So there was a very interesting conversation about the deliberative process of how you then suggest new names, or what should the citizen input be, and then we got to talk about how these monuments came to be in the first place and the process for setting them up. So for me, it was this really, really rich conversation. And also, people wanted to say, is this a slippery slope? Are we now going to have to rename everything? And then audience members chimed in and said, yes, it's a slippery slope, but it's a welcome slippery slope. And so it was one of my favorite sessions, but also one of the most politically charged.
Yes,
Yeah,
I'm sure.
yeah.
Do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
No, she covered it. Also, I wasn't there for that one. So.
Okay. What lessons and advice would you provide historians wishing to increase their level of engagement with the larger public, but understandably afraid of the professional costs and dangers that sometimes come with a greater public profile?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I wonder if by historian in this case we're talking about historians working in higher ed. I think that might have been kind of where the question was coming from. And I don't actually know that there are too many challenges or dangers, I think, with that, particularly as tenure and promotion committees, for instance, start to think more about how public history is an important thing that historians ought to be doing. I actually think that if there's anyone that's put in a place of danger for this, it's historians that are working outside of the protections of tenure, whether they be adjunct faculty or people working for a nonprofit or a consulting company. Me as the museum administrator in this case, I was, and I think you probably heard a lot about this when we would do our planning, I was very sensitive to how are the members going to respond to this topic and the panel that we're putting together, because if they respond negatively, that could affect our fundraising efforts. And it always worked out best, and it was as a side note, it was a marvelous fundraising vehicle in some respects. But I think those historians that don't have some of the protections might be a little bit more concerned about it. But I think that it can be done in such a way, again, respectfully, responsibly, deliberately, thoughtfully, where in our case, maybe some of my members might have seen the title and thought, oh no, what's going to be happening at this monuments thing? And then they show up for the conversation. It's politically charged, absolutely, but it's done thoughtfully, deliberately, with an eye to the past and thinking about analysis, where it actually pays off very nicely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have only seen benefits for myself professionally and personally in reaching this wider audience and explaining what it is I do and why I study history and how we locate ourselves and develop a historical consciousness. So I've seen only benefits.
Yeah, and the other thing I would add is maybe there are some historians working in or outside of higher ed that are anxious about these kinds of interactions with non-academic historians. Mm-hmm. And I would say those are some of the most interesting conversations that I've ever been a part of. And moreover, these audiences desperately wanted to be a part of these conversations. You know, I think that some of our friends and colleagues, historians, might think, oh, do people actually want to hear what I have to say about this? And the answer is absolutely. Mm-hmm. And they want to hear it, and they want to engage you on your work. So I don't see really any dangers in it. I think only opportunities.
Right. Do you have any suggestions for historians wishing to do a show like yours, but is working with limited resources or doesn't know what resources might be available to them?
Yeah, so I think the key to this is establishing relationships and partnerships. Looking into, so again, if we're talking about historians working inside of the academy, looking into the local historical societies and museums, other civic organizations, you know, the local city club. That was one of our best partners for this effort, was to partner between the museum, Willamette University, the Salem City Club, whose members were very much interested in the topics that we had. We also partnered with the Oregon Historical Society. Depending on topics, we partnered with other organizations. We had one that was dealing with minimum wage, and we worked with an employment education specialist, sort of workforce training kind of thing. These are the ways that not only do you build sort of the critical mass of resources that you need, you know, where are we going to have this, who's going to do the advertising, you know, who's going to pay for the drinks or whatever, right. But also really interesting ideas and conversations that came out of it. I could have cooked up some ideas for these programs, but they never would have been anywhere close to as interesting as the ideas that came from our conversations and then from the conversations that we would have with some of our partners as well. So I think partnerships are the key, and it requires community engagement. I don't think a program like this works if you decide you're going to try to figure it out on campus, because that's not where the interesting conversations are going to really happen in the way that they happen for this program.
Okay. I also think it was great that we were broadcast by KMUZ local radio. Oh. And I think that was an interesting aspect. I had not been on radio before, and it taught me new things about reaching an audience beyond a virtual audience, I guess. Yeah. So that was an important partnership.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And we also, Leslie mentioned earlier, work with Oregon Humanities. Oregon Humanities gave us a couple of grants to help with this. Oh, okay. And that was precisely because it was community engagement.
Do you want to talk about, do you have any sort of future ways that you're going to be engaging?
Well, you know, so some things have changed since we started the program. I've taken a position teaching and working in public history at Boise State University, so I'm no longer at the museum, but I've actually bringing this idea with me, and I'll be teaching an introductory class to freshmen called History in the News. So I'll have 100 students and a couple of discussion sections where we'll be doing very much of the same thing, identifying something that's hot and fresh and interesting and important in the news, and then analyzing the historical context and providing some commentary on that. So that's how I'm doing it in my position. I'm also, again, getting back to this question of the importance of relationships. In my position in public history at Boise State, I'm creating a lot of relationships with other history organizations, heritage organizations in the area, and trying to do similar sorts of public programming. And then you've got some really interesting ideas about hopefully maybe continuing this program.
Yes, I hope to continue it, but I would like to involve students more. So I'm bringing it back into the classroom, and I'm going to teach something maybe called a usable past or history of the present. And I'm going to do a public history class where the students are the ones generating the conversation topics and then doing the research to locate local journalists and activists and historians and experts in the field. And so that they'll be doing all that work, and then maybe even learning how to moderate. So it's then training public historians and then also getting the work done that we did all ourselves. So it's I'm bringing it back into the classroom. And
but then also like taking it out, like bringing some of the work into the classroom,
Yes.
but then also projecting it out, which is another part of what I'm hoping to do with this class on History in the News, is that the student, we're not just going to talk about it amongst ourselves. There will be public outreach, engagement, communication. You know, if the fundamental idea here is that thinking about the past and being able to think historically is a powerful tool, not just for students and academics, but for a wider audience, then we need to get the students out there being a part of that and doing those very things.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that all sounds very exciting, and it seems very relevant to the kind of engagement and conversation that that we need to have
Yeah.
today. As historians, we know that conflict is unavoidable and that scholarly debate often leads to richer and more in-depth understanding of the past. What strategies do you use to decrease the chance of healthy debate heading into vitriolic attacks?
I use the same strategies that I do teaching, which is asking people to back up their comments with evidence, to moderate at times, to ask new questions, to encourage and model, I guess, what that looks like. And so I think one of the things we did very well is that we had 3 or 4 panelists usually, and they would, in their interactions with each other, usually model an example of that, of how you disagree respectfully and how you came to your conclusions and how you might revise or change your argument on the basis of what you've heard. So they sort of modeled for the audience what that would look like. And then we did other things. Well, you did this.
Yeah, I mean, so we would often so the way this was structured, we'd have a brief roundtable at the beginning, and then it would go into a Q&A session with the audience. And sometimes often, more so than I expected, the questions coming from the audience were very much about the present. So we did we did one of these programs on taxation. It was coming up on a new vote on a ballot measure in Oregon, and I think one of the questions was something like, what should the Democrats do about taxation now? And I would often, with a question like that, I would have to say, that's a really interesting question. What if we think about it in terms of how have Democrats approached taxation in the past, so that it doesn't take it totally out of the present. How did Democrats approach taxation, but how have they, so that the past gets built into that question and into that kind of conversation. And I think that's one way that you can, first of all, fulfill the objectives of this program as compared to other sort of current events kinds of programming, where this is supposed to have the past as part of it, but also can provide a bit more safe space to have these conversations about current issues that are contextualized with the past. So, but I think, as Leslie said, and you were really good at this up on the stage, I should say, modeling for the rest of the audience how to talk about these really powerful issues, explosive issues in some ways, as historians would talk about them.
Yeah. And at times it means really speaking frankly about, like in the monuments session, we talked frankly about colonization and white supremacy, but we were able to do it by looking at how those conversations had been in the past, or silence in the past. So sometimes it means confronting conflict directly, not avoiding it or pretending or trying to brush it away or being too moderate, but actually pushing panelists and audience members to examine the assumptions that are driving their perspective.
While at the same time, and this is where the museum administrator in me comes out, while at the same time thinking about the audience and where they're coming from, I was always very aware of the members that were there. I knew many of them very well, and figuring out how to have these challenging conversations and be respectful of maybe respectful is not the right word, but recognizing where they're coming from and how they might respond to that, and then getting them to be involved in the conversation so that they don't feel alienated, which was another thing I think we did really well. There were some members of our organization that were, again, they might have been a little concerned about what the topic was, but as they got into the conversations, they were much more interested and they were engaged. So, it was between. This is why this partnership works so well, right? We would have. There's the historian and the museum director that are kind of, the tension there was is the definition of creative tension, I think.
Yeah,
I think worked really well.
yeah. And so maybe in that way we modeled also disagreement.
I think so, yeah.
Because we would sometimes disagree or have a different approach.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. My family laughs that I'm the moderator because I'm not known as particularly moderate. But there's also a certain freedom in being a moderator where you get to ask questions and draw out some implicit assumptions people are making, or ask them to make their argument more clear, or challenge aspects of that argument. So there's something really nice about being the moderator. Again, like teaching, where you get to really facilitate that conversation and have people be heard, but also challenge them even in the questions that you ask.
Right. Right. How do you balance or integrate local, national, and international topics?
Well, so again, as the museum administrator, every topic had to have some sort of local connection. At the Willamette Heritage Center, it's a regional history museum, and so the mission was very explicit. We need to connect this to local affairs. And then some of the grants were also very interested in making sure this was connected to what was happening locally. But that never meant that we had to ignore what was happening at a national or international level. It was about trying to find a hook. So Leslie was mentioning earlier the monuments controversy that was happening nationally, and locally there were plenty of connections to that. And one of the participants in the roundtable is a well-known historic preservationist who is involved with some of the monuments that are in the Salem area, and so she had some direct experience and connections with that. We never had to shy away from or pull away from larger events, broader events, but we always needed to find some connection to local issues. Okay. Anything you want to add?
No.
Okay.
Oh, good. What goes into selecting guests for your show?
Yeah. Did you want to start? Yeah.
Sure. I would say that was one of my favorite aspects of the program, because I got to learn about subjects that I didn't necessarily have expertise in very quickly. It's like being a journalist and doing your quick research, because we had a very short turnaround time. We would choose the topic on the first of the month, and then the session was the third Thursday. Wow. And so we had to act quickly. Right. And that was really exciting. So we would just do it the way you would. How did we do it?
Yeah, well, we warned our friends and colleagues in the area that we were doing this kind of thing. So even before the program started, we sent emails to people that we knew at local colleges and other historians saying, hey, we're starting this program and we're aware of your area of expertise, and you should know you're going to get an email at some point where I'm asking you to help out with a roundtable on whatever the issue might be. And maintaining that relationship, in addition to sort of going through websites and figuring who people were and what they were working on, having a list, maintaining those relationships. The other thing I would say about this is we never had anyone that we asked say, no, that doesn't sound interesting, I don't want to do it. Everyone we asked said, yes, absolutely, or gosh, I wish I could, but I'm busy. Can you keep me in mind? Can you put this topic off until I'm available? Right. So, some of it was the hard work that Leslie and I did in creating these lists and relationships, but I think a lot of it was the strength of the program that we created, which really attracted historians that want to be involved in these conversations.
And I think we were in the Willamette Valley, and so we could reach out to a lot of colleges and institutions, and the location was central. I can't imagine doing this in somewhere like Northfield, Minnesota, maybe, or I don't know how you would reach that many, although there's a lot of colleges around there too, but.
I mean, we have that, that is an advantage of the Willamette Valley, but, again, I think just the interest in the topic itself, or this approach, attracted people to it.
Yeah, and I was always so gratified when people so readily accepted and were very enthused. And to me, that speaks about a flip side of this. We've talked about public audiences' thirst for thinking historically, and I also think professional historians and historians in higher education have a thirst for reaching, again, outside the classroom, outside the profession, not just talking to other historians. And so people were really thirsty to do it and excited to do it, and that was really gratifying. And it was really wonderful to learn about people's work in fields that I wouldn't necessarily know. So for me, professionally as an historian, I learned a lot as well.
Great. Well, I think to wrap up here, we have one more question. What have you learned about the public's relationship with and to history since doing this show? And is there anything that surprised you?
Yeah. Two sides of it. One, I was very gratified and impressed by people's, again, thirst for history and wanting to think historically about themselves and their ability to locate themselves historically. And that especially came out when people would talk about their personal historical relationship to the subject at hand. So people would talk about monuments in particular that they had a relationship to, or we did one on sexual harassment and the Me Too movement. And hearing people's
testimony and hearing people talk about how they had navigated changes in the workplace and understandings of harassment was really gratifying. So people were able to locate themselves historically. The other thing that surprised me was how little people knew about the work historians do or how historians work. So a lot of times we ended up talking more about, or people learned more, I think, about how historians frame questions or find evidence or locate themselves vis-a-vis other historians. And so it would be more about that than the topic. So again, to cite the public monuments example, when people said, does this erase history? Coming back in and saying, well, history is a process of revising interpretations and contesting interpretations and finding new evidence and asking new questions or using new evidence to examine old questions. And so that was a rewarding aspect of it. And I think that surprised me that people didn't know really the art and craft of how historians work.
Right.
And what is history? We had a lot of conversations about that.
Yeah, and you know, when the thing that surprised me was the quick jump that audience members often made from, so the roundtable would talk about the past and try to put the present in that historical context. But during the Q&A, audience members would sort of move very quickly from, yeah, the past was important, let's talk about the present. That the connection between the two seemed to them clear and assumed, but they, I think in some cases, might have assumed too much, and we often had to spend some time talking about, well, you know, in what ways exactly is the past connected to this, and how do we get there? This is the interpretive act that's part of history. You know, I think many people in the audience saw history as the past rather than interpretations of the past, and that's sort of the thing we were moving towards in some of these conversations. I guess I knew that there was a thirst, as you said, for history. I think what I was surprised to see was how quickly people were willing to move past the step of thinking about how do we connect exactly the past to the present. You know.
All right. Well, I think that is all for today. Bob and Leslie, thank you very much for sitting with us.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thanks.